measure that you may suggest tonight or tomorrow.
This is the wetland that we have next to the, BJ's parking lot is going to be a much lower quality wetland than the one that's up in the woods, that's pristine. However, that one that's next to BJ's parking lot may actually be serving a much more important function in terms of cleaning things before it goes to the river than the one that's up in the woods. I'm actually not an environmental scientist. That just seems like it's a common sense type of perspective on it.
I mean, I can just sort of editorialize about borrow Patchen's words now that he's gone. There's one aspect of the services provided of a wetland, and we're focusing on wetlands here, and that is filtration of gradient nitrogen inputs or whatever it may be. That same wetland, including the frag that might be there as the invasive, is also providing nesting habitat for marsh nesting birds, and that those birds may not care, or they may care about the plant that's there. So it gets into these things that it's like it might be doing better than the natural wetland, but it's also providing this whole other suite of services that are accounted for.
But maybe in our annotated bibliography, we should look at the functions and values of urban wetlands and whether those factor in a different way. But anyway, it's an interesting question for sure.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Paul.
No, I think this is kind of what we have been struggling with
Right.
as a program.
Yep.
With the starting point being that we're trying to deal with these small releases, the relatively small oil spills at this, and then we'll talk about hazardous materials and groundwater later. But we can talk about more refined and more precise measures of damage for these. But at some point, and I think fairly quickly in the process, you are spending a lot of time and energy and money and resources evaluating relatively small releases with relatively small impacts. And so like the question of the invasive species, we would really like your input. We're proposing kind of one balance of a general measure of invasive species will have some input into this equation. You can go either way on it. You could put more effort into identifying what the species are, getting the species list, and hiring your wetland scientists, and doing a whole laundry list of things, and get more information. But is it going to move you? Is the value of that additional information worthwhile for these? Or you could go in the other direction and say, maybe invasive species shouldn't even be a category because it's you need an expert to identify it, and it doesn't really impact the function of the wetland as much as you might think. It will just treat invasive species as any other kind of vegetation. So there are different balances you can strike here, and we're trying out different things, and that's part of why we're talking to you. To say we're throwing out one option. Look at all of them, but look at them with the idea of balance. And that these are relatively small spills with relatively small claims coming out of it. And kind of in my view, my personal view, is that the beauty of having this standardized approach is that we can settle these small claims, and individually, they're small, it's not huge monetary values, but cumulatively, as we look at the watersheds, we might be able to have some good restoration projects come out of it and have some benefits where we're not seeing anything now. We're just accepting the damage as it happens. But we can't make this a huge overhead program for us or for the regulated community or even for the municipalities and the environmental organizations. There are too many of these spills all over the place, and this is not where we can spend a lot of our resources. But we think we can do something.
Hey, Paul, just a quick question on this.
I
Sorry,
do,
so-
but if you're following
No,
up,
just,
that's
and
okay.
it's not, I'm not looking for an answer or anything, but to that point, and then talking about the small dollars and so forth associated with a claim, you know, we're talking about the, you know, the 10 gallon and some range above that, where it's so small that it just may not be worth it. I don't know, just something to consider, because we talked about the high end a little bit, but on the low end, you know, I mean, there's just a lot of administration, there's just a lot of moving parts on both sides that, you know, I mean, I think we'd rather spend that money on the cleanup, right? I mean, and on all these, but just generally, is it worth it, I guess? for the
Well,
smaller ones?
Again, things that we struggle with, but kind of one thing that, I come at this from the cleanup side rather than the NRD side. And one of the things that I keep having to repeat to myself is that the cleanup requirements are the cleanup requirements. And this is not a trade-off. It's not one or the other. The cleanup has to be done and the cleanup has to meet the rules. But at the end of the day, the spill occurred, there was some damage, I'm not going to use the right words because I'm not an NRD guy, but there was damage from the point that the spill happened and when the cleanup was finished, in that interim period, interim damage?
Well, the
and
interim
then-
loss could extend beyond the cleanup.
And then there's still damage because cleanup is never complete, cleanup is never perfect. And particularly we're talking oil and wetlands, there are decisions made about it's got to biodegrade over time, you don't want it, you know, the damage that you would cause by going into the wetlands to get that last, you know, X number of gallons of oil, isn't worth it. But there's still damage there that's happening. And so there is damage that's occurring and we're not capturing that now. It may not, in the grand scheme of things, it isn't huge numbers individually, but it's, what we're trying to struggle is how much effort should be put in to recognize, acknowledge, and get some settlement for those damages so that we can put it to good use to improve it. And the questions about the urban wetlands and the degraded baseline conditions, those are degraded baseline conditions because there have been cumulative effects over time. And this is one way to, we're not going to stop it because there will always be these releases, but at least recognize it, acknowledge it, and have some resources to try to draw that back and improve it. Chris?
Relative to your point about is it worth it and the concern about trying to impose something on LSPs that they're neither qualified nor experienced to do, I think we've really given a lot of thought to relying on information that is already being provided to us through the cleanup process, and we do not anticipate asking for any other information than that from the PRP. So I think that's something that we haven't really been very clear about. And we do have to think about the invasive species, and I think some of that we thought about prior to actually entertaining the idea that maybe the PRP may want to actually, go through the calculations of the formula. So.
Yeah, even the invasive species, it was never intended that a wetland scientist would have to
Right.
be involved.
Exactly.
It was the
Exactly.
layman's take on it,
Yeah,
what invasive
and we
species are.
principally have wanted to rely on either the combination of the information that's already coming into us through the cleanup, coupled with readily available information that we may have on GIS that, or, so we weren't trying to set up a system where there's a lot of independent professional judgment that has to happen every time. That would defeat her.
We have to let Seth go because we put it.
I mean, patient. Actually now a couple things. One is in response to all this, I forget what the generic requirements are of the state, but at some point will you do some kind of regulatory impact analysis? Because there is the question, okay, it's only $500, but it adds up. But if the cost to do a single one of these is $1,000 for 500, then it's not worth it. And I take your point. The answer may be it's not $1,000 to do it, it's $20, and you should get your $500 because there is some damage. But those are relevant things to think about.
Yeah.
Second, on the endangered species thing, I'm going to disagree with my friend Ron. I think you're measuring the damage. If there's a degraded wetland, there's less damage than if the wetland's not degraded.
You mean
I think it-
invasive?
Yes, I'm sorry. In a simplified program, I mean, again, it's not a lot of money and transactions cost matter. My view is, PRP can say, I'm not gonna worry about this discount, I'll just call it not degraded, right? There's no obligation to say there's endangered species. They can pay full freight and assume the baseline is a perfect wetland. And if it's worth it to say, I got invasive species, my guess is you're not gonna challenge that because nobody's gonna save $400 unless they really think that they can save the $400. And the final thing, what I actually, my original question, and this goes, and I'm sure you folks have an answer to this, although Andy's not here, but you have a lawyer here still. I forget about retained money. I mean, do you have authority under 21E to actually retain this money and use it, or do you need new legal authority to be able to hold this money within your own accounts?
No,
It's a separate legal authority.
It-
Yeah.
Yeah, we have the NRD trust was established by the legislature.
Right. And you can just put the money there and
Yes.
everybody else.
Yep, so as long as we expend it under in accordance with the trust, we have a trust account, we have
Right.
the authority under our statute
Yeah, and we've been delegated by the statute specifically.
to administer that
to
trust.
administer it.
So when does a site in the MCPs, I have a spill, like this goes into effect August 1st. I have a spill on August 2nd that goes to the wetland. Takes me 3 months to clean it up and submit a permit solution. When is this, I guess number one, when does this come into that? Is it at the end of the permanent solution stage? And then secondly, present all the story, is it a moving forward thing? So spills that occur after
I'm
the,
gonna let Paul answer that. That's a Paul Locke question.
Yeah, we go back.
With maybe some consultation with his attorney.
Uh-oh. Keep in mind, I'm not an attorney.
Do you play one on TV?
It's been
I'll play one now.
Public video.
Our vision of this is that that it would be the point of the regulations moving forward. And it would particularly, setting up a system where the PRP can take the initiative and settle their liability by going through the forms, filling out the equations, cutting the check, and sending it in for presumptive approval. My view is that that would minimize the transaction costs. I like that term. We're going to keep using it. We would only expect that from the point where the regs go into effect and go into the future. And then, if we take the model or we do the model where DEP initiates all of that, and at some point you're waiting to get the demand letter from DEP, well, we have a certain amount of staff. We're going to pretty much focus on that and on into the future. And I think my lawyer would say that we always retain the ability to go back for any of these bills. And for any of these bills where we haven't settled NRD liability, there's NRD liability out there. But our focus for these standardized approaches.
Subject to a statute of limitations.
Yeah, all of that. Like I said, I'm not a lawyer.
is a release built into this that we cut the check, then we're released from?
That would be the lawyers would figure what that language. But that's it. That would be and in my experience, again, limited experience in NRD settlements, which is mostly big sites where the PRPs want to wrap up all of their liabilities, their obligations for cleanup and obligations for NRD, that settling all of that all at once in one fell swoop appears to be important to them. And this would certainly be on a smaller scale, but it would be part of that. If we don't comment at the end of presumptive approval, then it's done.
I think the question about the point in the MCP
Yeah.
process, I think we were thinking it's the point at which you have all the inputs. So it could be at the IRA completion statement, I think in a lot of these cases, it doesn't have to wait to the permanent solution stage. So it's not necessarily tied to an MCP submittal. And I think it might be good if it weren't, because that kind of keeps it clear that these are two separate things. The NRD is not an MCP response action. But I think for most of these sudden releases, probably at the point of an IRA completion statement, you have
I
the
plan to file it
information.
on day one for the things spread out.
Yeah.
One thing I just want to sort of flag is we're talking about releases that are impacting water, streams, wetlands, right? And in those situations, at some point, probably hopefully very quickly, there's an environmental agent involved, the Conservation Commission is involved, because it is, if it's a release that's completely on dry land, you may have only an LSP and you have no environmental people on retainer at all. But at the point where it's dealing with the water, I would expect that there would have been some kind of environmental person engaged as part of the cleanup process. So I was thinking back about the whole question of invasives and what's the quality of this resource and all. And I know I've honestly not had to deal with very many in Medford. This may have been actually the only one. And we dealt that in my tenure, and we issued some emergency approvals to go forward and do stuff, and then it came back to the Conservation Commission, and I have not gone back and looked at the filing, remember exactly what happened, but it would seem that there would be, am I wrong in thinking that? That there would be an environmental professional engaged as part of the cleanup because it's a water wetland spill?
Yeah, if you're working in a resource area and you want wetland
Right.
department approval, there's an opportunity during the IRA period to file emergency conditions.
And, right, it seems to me that that would be the person you would say, and fill out this form for me.